If you are ready, Holly, we'd be very happy for you to take the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I hope that you can now see my screen. I've pressed screen sharing. Does it look okay? Can you see it? Hopefully, yes. Thank you so much for inviting me to come and speak at the seminar. I'm going to be talking today about some of the work I've done on prosody in Breton, some of which I've been working on for quite a while. Bits of it have been published, but some is very new and the analysis is still preliminary. So I hope that you find it interesting. Let's start. So I'm sure that for this audience, I hardly need to introduce Breton, but just in case, it's the only modern Celtic language that's spoken outside the British Isles. And today there are around 207,000 speakers at the latest survey, but mean speaker age is about 70. And only 5% speakers are aged under 40. So I'm quite interested in new speakers, that is, those who've acquired the language by means other than intergenerational transmission. So around 90% of the speakers who are aged 15 to 24 today acquired Breton through formal education, for example. In September of this year, almost 20,000 pupils were enrolled in Breton medium education. There have been claims in the literature regarding new speakers Breton, centered really on purism on the one hand and the influence of French on the other. So the idea that new speakers Breton is lexically purist, but shows influence of French in the syntax and the morphology. And I'm really interested in finding out how far these claims are true. So why investigate prosody? Well, the Lexis has received a lot of attention in the literature. I mentioned already the purism of so-called neo-Breton. But prosody may not be so salient, but it might be particularly susceptible to contact-induced change. Matras writes, prosody seems to be more prone to cross-linguistic replication in context situations than segmental phonology, with stress figuring in between the two. So the phonology and particularly the prosody seem to be under-researched in comparison to the lexis or the syntax. So today I've got a kind of three areas of prosody to focus on. So first of all, stress at the word level, so lexical stress, and then stress beyond the word level, so looking at prosodic units that are a bit larger than a lexical word, and then finally moving to the utterance level with intonation. So to give you a bit of background on stress, most traditional Breton dialects have largely penultimate stress. There are some lexical exceptions that have word final stress. There's a small set of nouns like pimoch, pig, amon, butter. There are certain place names like Castellin. There are certain verbal forms. Mostly the verbal forms have final stress because there's been some sort of elision at some point. So we've ended up with a long final syllable, la carte. All the verbs that end in art have final stress. And certain adverbs and prepositions also have final stress, dirac, guéchal. There's also a region, the dialect spoken in the Gwynedd or the Vanate region have final stress, as do some neighbouring dialects. And my research hasn't focused on these. I've focused on the what are called the KLT dialects, so Kennard, Leonic, Geiriad, Breton, particularly for me, Kernavik, because I was interested in the contrast with the phrase final stress that we get in French. So here is a map of Breton dialects. Obviously, there's a bit more than a continuum than the black lines might suggest. But my research has been in the area that is shown by this rather wobbly oval. So that's where I've done my field work. For the work I did on stress, I worked with two groups of adult speakers. I had 11 older speakers and 9 younger speakers. Really, the big difference between them is how they've acquired Breton. I used to call them generations, but it was pointed out to me that the age range was much wider than a generation, and actually they're quite close together. the older speakers grew up speaking Breton at home with their parents, whereas the younger speakers didn't. They may have spoken Breton with an older relative, but for the most part, they've acquired Breton through formal education, self-study, etc., etc. I elicited individual words using pictures, and I did that rather than using translation, partly because I wanted to avoid French influence if possible. And I didn't use a word list because a lot of the older speakers are not literate in Breton. So using pictures means you can, they could just name it. My goal was to elicit 30 disyllabic and 30 trisyllabic words. Because I was using pictures, that didn't always work out. You can't always predict what sort of words people would use. I think I got 4 different words for butterfly, for example. But for the most part, that gave me the data I needed. When from an analysis, I did a perceptual analysis. So I listened to them, somebody else listened to them, and I supported this by doing acoustic measurements of vowel duration and intensity. Breton stressed vowels are longer and have greater intensity than unstressed vowels. Unstressed vowels are also susceptible to reduction, particularly in this part of Brittany, to the point that actually you can end up with syllabic consonants. So it's quite easy to tell if a vowel is unstressed or a syllable is unstressed. So what did I find? Well, this gives you a summary of my findings on stress. You can see, so the kind of paler purple, I hope this looks okay on your screens. The kind of paler purple colour is where we have penultimate stress. That's the expected stress pattern that for all of these words. And the sort of bluey purple colour is where we have final stress. And you can see that actually, despite what's claimed about new speakers sounding French, the younger speakers in disyllables are not really any different from the older speakers. There is a small difference in trisyllables. So we're seeing some sort of cross-generational difference, and this is captured quite nicely by this exchange. I'm afraid if you've heard me talk about stress before, then you probably heard this excerpt before because I really like it. But I worked with one older speaker, ZI, and his daughter was present at one of the recording sessions, and so we get both of them. So she's she's a younger speaker, but she teaches in the immersion schools, sorry, and a lot of her Breton has come through formal education, actually, rather than from her parents, because there was the habit of using French with your children to help them with their schooling, etc., etc. So it's quite an interesting family dynamic. Anyway, they are talking about this picture here, which is obviously a clock, or so I was hoping they would say it was a clock. And this is what they say. So I'll play the excerpt for you, but just to tell you what he says. So he makes a joke to begin with, because he says, "Oh, it's 10 minutes to 2," and then he laughs about it. And then she thinks he doesn't know what the word is, and so she's saying it for him, and then he says it, and their pronunciation is different. So let me play this for you. I hope that we have tested the sound, so fingers crossed it works.
Roulage.
Non.
Roulage.
So I hope you could hear there that the stress is different, and because the stress is different, the quality of the vowels is different as well. So when his daughter says it, she says roulage, with roulage, or even with a voice consonant at the end, stress on the final syllable. But when he says it, he says roulage, and we get reduction of that final unstressed vowel as well as penultimate stress. So we have a clear cross-generational difference here. So what does this picture of usage tell us about the metrical phonology of Breton? Well, we see 2 real systems here. We've got penultimate stress with a few exceptions that we talked about, and then we've got penultimate stress in disyllables, but final stress in trisyllables. So for the younger speakers, what we see is that those who use final stress in trisyllables do it quite a lot, whereas there's then another group of younger speakers who are like the older speakers and just use penultimate stress. So how can we analyse this using metrical phonology? When I was starting to do this, I came up with against the key issue of quantity sensitivity. So how do stress and syllable weight interact? Breton, unstressed vowels are always short, but stressed vowels may be long or short. So I had the question, well, are syllables long because they're stressed, or are they stressed because they're long? The crucial factor for Breton actually is consonant length. So Breton distinguishes between long fortis and short lenis consonants. There's a lot of discussion about the fortis lenis divide in the literature, but it's not always clear what that exactly is meant by this. So Falton did phonetic measurements showing a length distinction, but then Jackson claims that there are no geminates in Breton. So it's not quite clear what's meant here. More recent work seems to suggest that there is a length distinction. So if we look at what the contrast looks like in word finally, the contrast is lost, but it's reflected in the vowel length before that consonant. So we have dal and dal, and we have cas and cas. You can see that if you look at a morphologically related word, that this distinction is more obvious. So if you look at a derived word for these last two, so we've got cathadur, delivery, but kasig, kitten. So it's there's a vowel length distinction which follows from the consonant length distinction. In words of more than one syllable, then the penultimate syllable receives stress. If the following consonant is fortis, the vowel is short. If the following consonant is lenis, the vowel is long. This means that stressed syllables are bimeraic. So vowel length itself is not phonemic. It's the quality of the following, it's the length of the following consonant that matters. And actually, Falcon's work, this is what Falcon said in 1951, stressed syllables appear to be the same length no matter whether the vowel is short or long, because either we have a long vowel with a consonant, with a short consonant, or a short vowel and a long consonant. In monosyllables, the final consonant is extrametrical, so we don't hear the difference. So here we seem to have a quantity insensitive system where the P0 is always stressed regardless of the weight of the syllable. When we have a penultimate stress in a language, this suggests a trochaic pattern. Right? That's the simplest way of analysing it. I've given you two examples here. We've got barbik, fourchettes, so baby and fork. I realise I haven't put a translation. Carlyle suggests final consonant extrametricality, says, so she analyses it slightly differently. This would mean that we had a quantity-sensitive system with Moraic trochees. So I've given you this alternative analysis here, where the final consonant is extrametrical, which means that the final syllable in fourchettes is a single mora. It's light, and so the stress is on the penultimate syllable because it's the final syllable that can bear stress. The problem with this analysis comes from words with medial lenis consonants like pesceden. Here we have a long vowel in the stressed syllable, which is resulting from the following lenis consonant. We know that it's not underlyingly heavy because it's short in pesket. It's not pescade. I find that quite hard to say. But yes, it's not underlyingly heavy. The length follows from the following consonant. So then we would say, well, why does this final syllable in pescade not receive stress? The contrast between the monosyllables I gave you before, dal and dal, relies on the fact that only part of a fortis sonorant is extrametrical, and this contrasts with obstruents. The nasal in pesceden is fortis. It's reflected in the spelling in the derived pescedenu. We get a short vowel in the pescedenu, that syllable. A quantity-sensitive analysis would require the whole fortis sonorant to be extrametrical, and therefore monosyllables would have to be treated differently from polysyllables. So my feeling was that a metrical analysis that didn't rely on extrametricality was more consistent. So that's the analysis, the kind of standard analysis for Breton penultimate stress. But what about my younger speakers who are using penultimate stress in disyllables, but final stress in trisyllables? This was my biggest puzzle when I started the analysis. So it was like they could do it with disyllables, but they couldn't do it with trisyllables. And they clearly weren't just transferring French stress into Breton, which is often the claim, right? That we have phrase final stress in French, and this gets transferred over to Breton. But that's not what's happening here. They're not using the Breton pattern, but it's not the French pattern either. And so what I think is going on is that we've got a reanalysis of the stress system in Breton, probably under influence from French, and the fact that there are a not insubstantial number of words in Breton that always get final stress. Anyway, so traditional Breton is parsing from right to left. But new Breton, the Breton of new speakers, is parsing from left to right. The direction of parsing doesn't make any difference in a word that has an even number of syllables, but it matters in a word with an odd number of syllables. So let me show you this. So here we have traditional Breton at the top. We have penultimate stress. So we're parsing from left to right. We're forming our metrical feet starting at the left edge. The Breton of new speakers, new Breton, it sounds a bit odd, but in the Breton of new speakers, we parse, sorry, they've ended up both as left to right. The traditional Breton should have parsed from right to left. Sorry about that typo. But new Breton is parsing from left to right. So we form our metrical feet starting from the left edge. So this is the difference here. We've got, we start from the left edge and we form a trochee here, a left-headed foot, and then we form our final foot here, and that's the one that gets the main stress in the word. This contrasts with traditional Breton, which passes from right to left. Sorry about that. We start at this edge and we form our first trochee here. So this is the one that gets the main stress. So that's my story about stress in Breton. Once I'd kind of done that work, I was interested in other kind of puzzles in Breton stress that were interesting. So these are what I realized united them quite nicely was the idea of the prosodic word. So I'm going to tell you first about stress with clitics and monosyllables, and then with compounds. So in Breton, monosyllabic content words, nouns, verbs, adjectives, are usually stressed. There are some monosyllables that cannot take stress in Breton. These are the definite article, possessive, certain verbal particles, certain prepositions. However, when a monosyllable is preceded by certain function words, the stress falls on the function word, not the content word. For example, we have bak, boat, which becomes alvak, the boat. So far, so good. But orvak, a boat. So when it's the indefinite article, which has three forms depending on the first sound, the first phoneme of the noun. When it's the indefinite article, when there is a numeral, the ordinal ale, certain adverbs can all sort of take the stress from the monosyllabic content word. So from a phonological perspective, what's happening here? It seems that the proclitic, so the clitic word that comes before the lexical word, and its host form a single prosodic word, which then receives the normal penultimate stress. So when we have the indefinite article, we end up with a single prosodic word, and we get penultimate stress on the article, but that doesn't happen with the definite article because it doesn't behave in the same way. We can only observe this process with monosyllabic words because in longer words, the stress just remains penultimate and the addition of material on the front of the word doesn't make any difference. And this clitic stress, as I have been calling it, does not occur in the Gwynedd dialects because the stress there is usually final. So this seems a reasonable explanation of what's happening. So when I was doing my fieldwork, what I really expected to find was that older speakers were maintaining the pattern, but younger speakers might not be. That seemed like a reasonable assumption to make. So that was what I was, or at least I wanted to know if that was the case. Actually, when I did my fieldwork, I found that most speakers weren't using clitic stress at all. And that went for speakers of all linguistic backgrounds and ages. There were 2 speakers who had some examples, but nobody had 100% clitic stress where I would have expected it. So what's going on here? I had three suggestions. Is this, first of all, a regional feature? So have I just gone to the wrong part of Brittany? Is it absent from this variety of Breton? Not impossible, given a lot of descriptions of Breton are not based on Kernavik, they're based on the northwestern varieties, so it was a possibility. Is it language attrition? So Dressler talks a lot about the loss of typically Breton features in the phonology and morphology, not just in the syntax, so it's possible it was that. Or is it ongoing language change? Is this just Breton is just changing? So I explored these questions using data from the 2 Breton linguistic atlases and an online Breton sound bank, so the Banque Sonore des Dialectes Bretons, the sound bank of Breton dialects, in the hope I would get some kind of regional and temporal perspective on the phenomenon. So the Atlas linguistique de la Basse-Bretagne, the data for this were collected around the time of the First World War, just before and just after. There are 77 points of inquiry across 600 maps. And then we have the Nouvel Atlas linguistique de la Basse-Bretagne, which has more points of inquiry, but the same number of maps. They're not the same maps, though, just slightly confusingly. The things that they were asking for were slightly different. The data for this were sort of after the Second World War, over a couple of decades, I seem to remember. And then the most recent, the Banque Sonore des Dialectes Bretons, has been, so data for that have been collected more recently. It's an online repository of Breton language recordings, all sorts of things, so stories, people's memories of what life was like when they were children, songs, descriptions of things, all sorts. At the time I did the data collection, there were 76 points of inquiry and more than 34 hours of recording. Since I did this, some recordings have been deleted from the archive, which is a real shame. But I contacted the owner of the recordings and he gave me permission to continue to use the data I had extracted for my research. So if you were to go and look up some of this stuff, it might not be there, but it's because it's been withdrawn from the archive. So what do we find? Well, the data are somewhat limited. In the original atlas, there's one map with a monosyllabic noun preceded by an indefinite article. It's a hare. There are more in the more recent atlas, so there are 13 with at least some information, and I've put at least some because not all maps have all points covered, and sometimes there's a lexical variant of the word that is disyllabic. For example, this is true of tree. For some speakers it's ven, for some speakers it's wesen, so it's no good if it's 2 syllables, etc., etc. When I searched in the sound bank, I mean, you can't go and search a corpus for the indefinite article. You get an unmanageable number of results. So I limited my search to 30 monosyllabic nouns, and I searched for article plus monosyllabic noun, and I got 19 different ones across 23 points of inquiry. The findings suggest that clitic stress, so stress on the article, is a regional feature, that it's concentrated in the north and the west, and that there's I've drawn a tentative dividing line between the 2 areas. So let me show you some maps. So here, this is from the original atlas, Atlas linguistique de la Basse-Bretagne. So we've got stress on the article, these circles. This is stress on the noun, and then the rest of the points aren't helpful to me. These are all the ones where the person they talked to gave the definite article, not the indefinite article, and in these ones there's no stress marked. And just to show you what the Nouvel Atlas linguistique looks like, this is in fact a tree, and you can see I've circled here the ones where we've got stress on the article. So this is actually the part of Brittany that I worked in. So Quimper is around here, so I was in this sort of area here. The data from the Nouvel Atlas allowed me to draw this map. And this is an analysis of all the available maps and data points. So here, the darker the spot, the more clitic stress there is. And this is what let me draw this tentative dividing line between areas that have clitic stress and areas that don't seem to. As you can see, this line goes across, these are the dialect boundaries, these lines in the background. And so this clitic stress line is going down straight through the middle of these two areas, so Kennard in the south and Llydaweg in the north. It's not that it's unique to a particular dialect, it's sort of a broader area than that. However fuzzy these boundaries may be, it goes quite clearly through the middle. So how does the more recent data fit in? Well, the tentative dividing line I've just shown you is sustained by the data I got from the sound bank. So clitic stress is only found in extracts that come from points west of the line. There is variability within this area, as you can see here. We've got stress on the article 72% of the time, but stress on the monosyllabic noun 21% of the time, and then somewhere I couldn't tell. So to show you what sort of excerpts look like, we've got one here from the Ile-de-Seine. This is interesting because this is about the only point where there's enough examples from the same point that we have something kind of more to say about it. So there are 32 possible contexts, 26 show clitic stress. There's more than one speaker, so I think it's probably interspeaker variation that's going on here, and that younger traditional speakers, so not new speakers, but the younger traditional speakers might be less likely to use clitic stress, but I just don't have enough data to be certain about that. I then looked at numerals, did the same methodology. So there are the older atlas actually has more data for the numerals, whereas the new atlas doesn't. So we've got 7 maps. You can see that in comparison to the indefinite article, there's a greater proportion of clitic stress with numerals than with the indefinite article, and it's more consistent. It extends further southeast. And this is backed up by the data that we see in the sound bank. The line that I drew seems less relevant here, but there is a lower proportion of clitic stress in the Gwynedd region, as we would expect, because this is an area of Brittany that has final stress. I then looked at one last context, which was the adverb ré, meaning too. So too hot, too cold, etc. There's one map in the Nouvelle Atlas, and there's nothing in the original atlas. The issue with this map is that it's not always clear where the stress is, because I think different field workers marked it differently. So we've got initial stress marked, and that's brilliant. Then we just have it written as a single word, which implies initial stress based on what is said about the conventions for marking stress in the introduction to the atlas, but it's not explicit. And then we have it written as 2 words, which seems to imply that the stress is not on the adverb, but I can't say that for certain. And there are areas with no data. So definite cases of clitic stress are concentrated in the southwest, so these are these ones, whereas the possible cases are in the northwest. So really it has a similar distribution to the indefinite article. The sound bank data, like the atlas data, there's a greater extent of clitic stress. You can see it's mostly in the western area. There's a little bit in the eastern area. In sum, then, clitic stress with numerals and ré is more widespread for contexts other than the indefinite article. So why would that be? The indefinite article, I think, is more vulnerable to change. It's often phonologically reduced as a word. So you just end up with a syllabic consonant, for example, whereas numerals can be and often are stressed. So what I think is happening is that we have a loss of clitic stress in general, and that this is an ongoing process. But that stress is retained on numerals, which then just bear their own stress. So the 2 words are no longer forming a phonological unit. And a few entries in the Banque Sonore seem to indicate this. So the clitic and the host no longer form a single prosodic word for stress assignment, and we get uniform treatment of the definite and indefinite articles. And this ties in quite nicely with what has been said about different types of clitic. So Selkirk and others have proposed a sort of hierarchy of clitics, where depending on the relationship with the host. The definite article is what we might call a free clitic because it doesn't interact with stress assignment and it's not an independent prosodic word. The indefinite article seems to be moving from being an affixal clitic to a free clitic. An affixal clitic is passed during a post-lexical pass of stress assignment, which would fit with the data that we're seeing. But it seems to be becoming more like the definite article. The indefinite article, incidentally, is derived from the numeral unon, one, which would explain why it behaves like, or used to behave like a numeral. So that's my bit about stress with monosyllables. I have a little bit now about stress in compounds, although not as much as I hoped, because the data have been somewhat elusive. So Breton compounds often have final stress. So I've given you some examples here. We've got Borus, Robin, Trugmore, seasickness. These compounds have the structure head modifier, but Breton also has compounds of the other sort, modifier head. These modifier head compounds are usually older, they're more firmly connected. They are sometimes called in the literature strict as opposed to loose compounds, and I think that terminology is used for Welsh as well. Stress still falls on the modifier, however. So we have rognes, morvelis, so we get so stress is penultimate in these words here. Interestingly, there are also doublets, so where both orientations of the head and the modifier exist for the same word. So one example is otter. You can have dorgi or kidur, and the stress is on the modifier either way. So what's happening here from a phonological perspective? It seems that strict compounds behave like a single prosodic word stressed on the penult, whereas loose compounds are two prosodic words with the main stress on the second prosodic word. This is reflected in patterns of pluralization. So loose compounds seem to behave as two separate words in some way. There's pluralization on the head or on both elements if they're both nouns in some cases. And the pattern of pluralization reflects regular plurals. So kidur has the plural chasse-dur. The regular plural of qui in Breton is chasse. In strict compounds, we have pluralization only on the head, and this may vary from the regular plural. So dorgi has the plural durgon, which I think is related to the Welsh plural of dog. So it's some kind of etymological hangover. And the same is true of shark. So this seems to reflect how closely bound the two elements of the compound are. But what do speakers actually do? I'm returning to my usual question. Are new and traditional speakers different? In this case, it seems no, they're not really. So many classic compounds are not used very much in my data. I got a lot of loan words, or there was just a lexical gap. So things like tourton for lighthouse. A lot of people just gave me phare, which is borrowing from French. Overwhelmingly, then I get loose, the new form of compounds in the fieldwork data. Of my 208 tokens, only 3 were strict compounds, and they were all the same, as we'll see on the next slide. Stress in loose compounds falls on the modifier. Now that might be a monosyllabic modifier, so yeah, milindur, that seems to give us final stress, or it might be that it's a disyllabic or trisyllabic modifier, in which case we overwhelmingly get penultimate stress, milin arvel. I haven't given you statistics here because there weren't really any exceptions to this. For once, my speakers are doing exactly what the books say that they do. What about my few examples of strict compounds? Well, they are all the same one lexeme, and it is dorgi, the otter example. So I have 5 people gave me kidur, and 3 people gave me dorgi. Kidur has final stress on the modifier. I'm going to play you some examples, so it's not just my voice you're listening to.
Ahidur.
Ahidur.
So that's an older speaker and then a younger speaker. It's the same. For dorki, I have 3 examples, as I say. 2 are very clearly penultimate stress on the modifier.
Un dorgi.
Un dorgi.
This last one, I think, has final stress, but it's very difficult to tell. And I only have this one example, so I haven't got much basis for comparison.
Un dorgi.
So I think, let me play it again.
Un dorgi.
I think that's final stress. That's a younger adult speaker, as in fact these 2 speakers are as well. Really, I need more data, and my plan was to look at the sound bank and to say how much are strict compounds used in comparison to loose compounds. But my initial searches suggest, well, not very much. It's hard to find strict compounds. I'd like to know what the stress pattern is. I'd like to compare it with loose compounds. But what's intriguing about compounds is that there's a lot of literature on the interesting ways they behave, but then it's unclear whether speakers are actually using these words in today's Breton, and it's something I'd really like to explore further. So to summarise, units larger than the prosodic word behave differently yet regularly for stress assignment, and that we may have 2 different kinds of language change in progress. So a loss of clitic stress on the one hand, and perhaps lexical change that's having an impact on compounding on the other. So finally, I hope I've got time to tell you about intonation. So this is my really new work. I was interested in intonation because I wanted to go beyond the word level. Really, I started by thinking, well, what happens to stress in context? And I thought, hang on, I could do a bit more than this. Like other aspects of prosody, intonation is understudied in Breton. Ternus gives some details. So examples like this is what you get in Ternus's book, or his chapter in the book. This suggests, to me at least, a low boundary tone in statements, a high boundary tone in yes/no questions. But this is interesting, but it's kind of limited because it's not based on any kind of empirical data, or not that he says anyway. More recently, though, people are taking an interest in Breton prosody. So Elfner et al. Look at the interaction between word order and prosodic phrasing. They do a qualitative study of 4 speakers where they have predefined sentences that they ask to be translated into Breton from French. They identify the phonological phrase as the domain for pitch accent, and they note that the auxiliary and the subject are grouped prosodically. So they have some really interesting findings, but it's very preliminary work. What I'm interested in is, well, what about more natural speech? And of course, is there a difference between new and traditional speakers? And what about other kinds of utterance, not just statements? This is my new project. I'm using connected speech data, which I collected on earlier fieldwork. So I used the frog story, which you may have heard of. There's a series of books, in fact, by Mercer Mayer, where they're just pictures. There's no text, so it's all about a little boy and he has a pet frog and he loses it. And speakers tell the story of what's happening just from pictures. So there's no text involved, which was ideal for my purposes. I have data from 3 groups, so as they're the same people I worked with before largely, so I have older adults and younger adults, and I also did this with teenagers because I was doing research in the Lycée Diwan in Carhaix. So this is the highest level Breton immersion schooling. It's for ages 15 to 18. So I had 33 students that took part in in this part of my fieldwork. I used 2 books. That's what these 2 numbers are. I'm sorry, I didn't say that. So there's the standard one, Frog, Where Are You? And then because I went back again, I had Frog on His Own. So these are the people who did Frog on His Own as well. Largely, of course, the teenagers all moved on in the school, so I didn't work with the same ones. But one of them did both books for me. So this is a preliminary analysis, as I say. I've just got started really since I collected the data. That we had the pandemic and I've had 2 babies, so I'm just sort of getting going with it now, and it's joint with my doctoral student Llydaweg. She's just completed her thesis on intonation in a tonal language and she was really keen to learn about another context. So we've annotated 55 recordings, and today I'm giving you some results on WH questions and declarative statements, those that begin with but, me, and those that begin with the word and, or ag. This gives us some level of consistency within the data set as a starting point. So What about WH questions first? Well, we have consistent pitch prominence of heightened pitch. So the WH word seems to receive a high pitch consistently. But the boundary tones are much more variable. About 40% of the boundary tones are high, so we get a rising intonation, which you would expect in a question, potentially. But around 35% are falling, so it's not very clear. And then there are a whole array of more complex boundary tones. Why is there this variability? Well, it could be that there's pragmatic differences that we haven't unpicked yet. It could be that there's differences between speaker groups, or there's some sort of regional variation, or it could be that these are just different types of question that we haven't managed to separate out yet. I've got an example here, so you can see this one has a low boundary tone, and this is the question word what, and this is the low high, the high pitch that marks it. Let me play it for you. Oops. So that gives you an example of what these sentences are like. Now looking at statements, we've got contrastive statements, meaning that they begin with but. The word mit itself frequently receives pitch prominence, so it's often marked with high pitch when it's in utterance in initial position, as it is here. This establishes a contrastive frame early in the utterance. However, again, we have diverse boundary tone distribution. So around 40% are low, which would be typical of a declarative statement, but around 30% are high, which is still very frequent. And then we have a whole array again of complex boundaries that seem to have some other nuanced meaning. Here's an example of one that begins with but. So here's the pitch accent, and here's the boundary tone, which is high in this case. It's very fast. This is a teenager speaking. And then we have declarative utterances with and these are the most interesting ones because they are the most systematic. So we've got systematic rising low-high pitch accent on the word and. Almost every instance has this pitch accent, which is very nice to see. The rising contour is probably a prosodic signal of coordination. It's rather like a continuation rise. It launches you into the new clause. And crucially, it's distinct from but, which has a different pitch accent. We have much more consistency in boundary tones, which is nice to see as well. Around 85% have a low boundary tone, and there are occasional other boundary tones. We also see what's we might term prosodic chaining. So we get multiple peaks through the phrase and then a final boundary tone. And these cascading rises give a narrative momentum and result in a wave-like prosodic structure. So overall, our work seems to suggest that we need to look at the phrasal as well as the lexical level, but that lexical items can attract high pitch. And I've got two final examples for you. So, because I'm aware I'm running out of time. So this is, and there perhaps he's heard something. Oops. It's very fast again, but I hope you can hear there's this the chaining, the successive waves of high pitch there. And then the final example, I'm sorry, the English translation is terrible, yeah, the dog is galloping as he follows on, I think would maybe be a more idiomatic translation. Let me just play that again. So again, we've got these low high pitch accents and a final low boundary tone. Obviously, this is very preliminary. We have a number of next steps planned. So we need to finish the analysis, look at the rest of the declarative utterances. I would like to look at exclamations and yes/no questions, but I'm slightly worried we don't have enough in the data set because, of course, they were telling a story. There aren't that many yes/no questions when you're telling a story, and I want to look more explicitly at the phonological phrasing. But particularly, I want to know what's conditioning the variation that we observe. Is it indeed speaker group? That would be very exciting if it is. Is it the type of question and statements, or is it something pragmatic? What is the role of word order given Elfner et al.'s work, which focuses on word order? It'd be really interesting to look at this. And finally, is there influence from French? For some speakers, I do have them doing the same story in French, and it would be lovely to do some kind of comparison, but that is a long way off in terms of analysis. So in summary, prosody is fascinating but understudied within Breton linguistics. The penultimate stress we see in the KLT dialect is being maintained even by new speakers. Some new speakers seem to be reanalyzing Breton stress, probably under French influence, but it's not a straightforward transfer. Proclitics can form a prosodic word with their host and therefore receive stress, but there's a loss of this construction over at least the course of the 20th century. Strict compounds form a single prosodic word and loose compounds seem to form two, but strict compounds seem to be less frequent in the data than we might expect from reading the literature on this. So perhaps we're seeing a rise in this new pattern of two separate prosodic words. My preliminary work on intonation suggests a consistent low boundary tone in certain declaratives and a high pitch accent in WH questions. There's lots of variation that I've yet to investigate. So I'll finish with some acknowledgements. Thank you very much. Merci place to GROE to start with, who's helped extensively with the intonation analysis, and then Mayalek, who initially transcribed the Frug story recordings. The work has obviously had funding, so I was funded by my postdoctoral fellowship when I did the field work, and since then the work on intonation has benefited from a returning carers grant and a grant from the OUP Research Fund. Thank you all very much for coming and listening.